I love that, Megan. It's great. All right, so game plan for today. We are moving into kind of the second major topic of the unit, which is really kind of just looking at these. So that's what we're kind of moving into. So we'll kind of quickly wrap up World War I and transition into that. Oh, nice, Ray. Glad to see there are other fans out there. Melissa with Dungeons and Dragons, all-time classic. Good deal. So vocab here on the whiteboard. One thing to note, I definitely have gotten some sort of cold/cough from my son's daycare germs. So hopefully able to get through class all right, but apologies in advance if I have like a coughing fit or something and gotta like mute the mic. We'll do the best we can here. Reminders on the right. At this point, we are less than 2 weeks until the end of the semester. Which on one hand, great. Winter break right around the corner, but for those of you who maybe have a lot of missing assignments in the grade book, definitely want to be working on getting those turned in, and of course reach out, send me an email if you need help with anything. And again, don't forget that you have that extra credit project available to you if you are like, I desperately need some extra points for my grade. That is an option for you. All right. So, and hey there, Guadalupe. So we wrapped up World War I on Monday. And so to kind of just tie a bow on that real fast to kind of transition into our lesson today, we saw at the end that, at least in the short term, America will largely reject Wilson's version of a more interconnected world, with the United States being a world leader. Again, America ultimately never ratified the Treaty of Versailles. We make our own separate peace agreement with Germany. America will never join the League of Nations. And as we head into the 1920s, we're going to see America elect a series of conservative presidents that will shrink back from international involvement. A kind of temporary return to that philosophy of isolationism, that America just kind of focuses on doing its own thing. We don't really care or get involved with what's going on in the rest of the world. But as we will see going into next semester, that's somewhat going to backfire, as we will have the rise of fascist dictators in the 1920s, going into the 1930s. And so after World War II, we will ultimately see the United States embrace much of Wilson's international goals. But as if World War I wasn't enough to deal with, beginning in early 1918, we also have the emergence of what I believe is the deadliest disease outbreak in U.S. history, the arrival of Spanish flu. A new strain of the flu that spread across the world, infected roughly about a third of the entire population, and ultimately killed somewhere between 17 to 100 million people in the late 19-teens, which you may be like, hey, that's kind of like a crazy range there. Part of the reason why we don't know a better estimate of how many people died from the disease is because the war was going on. And so countries were not willing to share information with one another, because it's like, well, you're my opponent. I don't want to help you in combating this disease. In fact, the reason why it becomes called Spanish flu is because Spain is one of the only, one of the rare countries being upfront about the development of this disease, because it was not involved in World War I. And so since it was like one of the only countries openly talking about it, it becomes called Spanish flu, even though it most likely did not originate in Spain. There's actually a decent chance it originated in the United States. But by calling it Spanish flu, what might people think about Spanish people at this point in history in the United States? Hey, Christian, glad you can make it. Yeah, absolutely. There very much became a negative stigma against Spain or people from Spain. That, you want to stay away from those people. They're the originators of Spanish flu. They probably have it. They'll probably give it to you. Yeah, those people are dirty. They're sick. They're infected. Stay away from them. When, of course, in reality, that was not the case. And so I stress that point because if you recall our country's more recent experience with COVID, there was kind of a similar argument on what should we call the disease, with some people wanting to call it the China virus or the Wuhan flu, because it originated from the Wuhan province of China. But other people pushing back against that, saying that's going to cause some discrimination, that's going to cause people to negatively associate the disease with a certain group of people, when, of course, ultimately, diseases don't really discriminate. They will infect whoever they can infect. But as you can see, looking at the photographs on the right, various health precautions were put into effect as a way of trying to slow down the spread of Spanish flu, which ultimately the country really struggled with, because what would happen is health precautions would go in effect. Then the spread of the disease would die down, and people would then start to think, oh, problem solved. We can go back to life as normal. And people would stop the health precautions early. That would then allow Spanish flu to reemerge and kind of have another wave of infections. Health precautions would have to go back in effect. And this cycle repeated ultimately 4 times, until eventually, the strain mutated, it died down, it no longer became the national health threat that it was. But here on the whiteboard, we have several newspaper headlines during this time period of Spanish flu. Taking a look at them, and thinking back to our own more recent experiences with COVID, in what ways do you see either some similarities or differences with the COVID response we went through more recently as a country? Excellent, Kylie. Yes, absolutely. heated debates on mask wearing. Health professionals telling Americans, hey, wearing a mask is one of the best things we can all do to try to help slow down the spread of the disease and help keep other people healthy. Clearly, other people refusing to do so. I think it's kind of illustrated here with this. Open-faced sneezers to be arrested. Or this article, which was from the Indianapolis Star. The man who is unwilling to wear a flu mask usually is the kind who expects everybody to listen to him when he speaks. So there really was, a similar debate back in the 19-teens of, making sacrifices for the greater good versus what people individually wanted to do or not do in this case. Looking at the headlines, what seemed to be other issues that the country faced during Spanish flu? Excellent, Christian. Yes. The enforcement of curfews to try to limit the amount of time people are, coming into contact with one another and potentially spreading the disease. Trying to limit the size of crowds, which are obviously perfect environments to rapidly spread a disease. This debate on keeping church windows open. Governments recognizing that, hey, religion's like really important to people. And, back then they couldn't do like virtual religious services. So they're like, oh, we can't really just like close down churches. People probably aren't going to accept that, but how do we try to then limit the spread of the disease while people are at church? Well, let's insist on keeping windows open. That at least, increases airflow, hopefully somewhat minimizes the spread of the disease, which ultimately the country went through very similar debates during COVID of, churches refusing to close down. And then there being this like pressure of like, well, could you at least keep the windows open? Try to do some things to minimize the spread of disease. So it is interesting. A lot of the debate we ended up having as a country during COVID, we had previously gone through as a country about 100 years ago with Spanish flu, but by that point in time, so much history had passed, people kind of forgot. And so we kind of had to relearn these lessons all over again. And that is going to be part of a reoccurring pattern in U.S. history, is the resistance among some Americans to go along with the advice of health professionals. There were people in the 1910s saying, I don't think the masks are going to do anything. They make me uncomfortable. I'm not going to wear one. Then when we get into the 1930s, we're going to start to see the introduction of new vaccines, which are going to do a remarkable job in eliminating or severely reducing at least major diseases that threaten the health of the American people. Things like whooping cough, a little bit down the road, 1950s polio. But we're again going to have people who say, I as an individual, I'm not on board with this, and are going to resist those health advancements. And in various ways, we still see that to this day. I mean, our current Secretary of Health is in opposition to vaccines in various ways. So this will continue to be an ongoing aspect of American society, of what is best for us to do collectively as a country to keep each other healthy versus what do people individually want to do. As if that weren't enough, there was another major wrestling of things with the country during this time period. The reemergence of nativism with what's known as the Red Scare. So to make a very long, complicated story short, in 1917, during World War I, there is a revolution in Russia. The Russian monarchy, or czar, is overthrown and ultimately replaced by a communist government, which we're going to talk more about communism next semester. But for today, communism is basically anti-capitalist. So whereas capitalism argues for the existence of private businesses that get to make their own individual decisions on what they produce and what price they sell it at, communism argues that industry should be controlled by the collective, with then resources being distributed out as evenly as possible to people as needed in order to try to eliminate the gap between the rich and the poor. So with the United States, being a largely capitalist country, America is going to view communism as being a threat to our way of doing things. And when you then combine that with the high level of xenophobia, the fear of foreigners that existed during World War I, what might you suspect as being the result of this growing fear in the United States? That's a good thought. In some ways, an attempt to fight Russia. Ultimately, not directly, because America doesn't really want to risk getting involved in a full-blown war with Russia. But during World War I, President Wilson will order U.S. troops into Russia to re-obtain weapons that we had sent to Russia before it became communist, which ultimately the communist forces in Russia did not appreciate, viewed that as kind of being a violation of their independence. So absolutely, there's going to be this growing tension between the United States and Russia. What might be some results within the United States? For example, how might the country react to Russian immigrants within the United States? Definitely Christian. A significant rise in prejudice because there became this growing fear in the United States that anyone from Russia or potentially any sort of immigrant might secretly be a communist that is trying to spread communism, or Bolshevism as it was also known back then, into the United States and to try to destroy the United States from the inside out. So that is why we call it the Red Scare, as the color red will be the color associated with the Communist Party in the Soviet Union. And historically speaking, when people become scared about a threat, they typically then want to see more be done to address that threat. And so that's going to include a desire to severely restrict the amount of immigrants coming into the United States. And we can see that here on the chart, that in the late 1910s, immigration into the United States, almost entirely shuts down compared to where it had been. And so this may be the best opportunity to answer this student question. Student asking, in what ways has our country's history been unique compared to other nations or countries? And generally speaking, I think most elements of U.S. history, you can find comparisons to the history of other countries. For example, on the topic of immigration, there are definitely other countries that have wrestled with, how open do they want to be? How flexible do they want to be in allowing immigrants to come into our country? But one thing that I would say is unique about the United States is we are really the only country of immigrants that then wrestles with the topic of allowing new immigrants into the United States. When a European country wrestles with the topic of immigration, you have an established nationality, the French or the Germans, and they're wrestling with this view of an outside group coming into the United States. But here in the United States of America, unless you are 100% Native American, you yourself are only here today because you have family ancestors who were immigrants who came into the United States. And so that is something that is unique about the United States. And so in the 1910s, you have the population of the United States that is largely made up of the descendants of immigrants now saying, well, we don't want this new generation of immigrants coming into the United States. We're glad we're here, but we're now afraid that this new generation of immigrants will be what destroys the country. And that continues to be something the country will wrestle with generation after generation. And, of course, we still very much see that debate in the United States today, especially in regards to things like the expansion of ICE and deportations and everything that's going on in the news today. So back in the 19-teens, you did not have ICE. Instead, you had what were called the Palmer raids, a series of raids conducted in November of 1919 and January of 1920 by the United States Department of Justice to capture and arrest immigrants who were suspected of being anarchist, calling for the overthrow of government, or communist, and deporting them from the United States. And so at the time, this was justified as doing what was necessary to protect the country. But it also created controversy, because what potentially might be the issue with government going after people for their political beliefs? Definitely, Melissa. Some argued that that was a violation of protected freedoms of the United States. The First Amendment says we have freedom of speech, we have freedom of the press, we have the right to petition and protest against the government. This all felt like a violation of the First Amendment. And then, excellent Christian, there were others who argued that this kind of violated the original spirit of the United States. The idea that, this would be a country where you would not have an authoritarian government that gets to tell the people what they can or cannot believe. Others viewed it as a violation of government power, that, if government is allowed to go after a small group of people because of their political beliefs, could you then have politicians that go after their political opponents in order to stay in power? Could you have one political party start arresting and jailing people of another political party in order to help ensure that they continue to win elections and stay in power? And so, as we will continue to see, this is another issue that the country will continuously wrestle with, is how much power should the government have to maintain security within the United States, versus when is it going too far and potentially a violation of our rights and freedoms as U.S. citizens. But at the time, many Americans did not speak out against the Palmer raids because they didn't view themselves as being personal victims of this, of like, oh, well, the government's going after a small group of immigrants who potentially might be communists. I'm not an immigrant. I'm not a communist. This doesn't impact me. I don't have to worry about it. And so what we're kind of seeing here is a shift in kind of the national viewpoint within the country. After the significant changes of the more liberal progressive era. And then you have World War I, where you really kind of had an expansion of government involvement, as we saw on Monday. With the rise of conservative concerns, like the Red Scare, the concern of too many immigrants coming into the United States, the country is really going to see a political shift going into the 1920s. And so, to kind of help wrap our minds around what's going on in the country in the 1920s, I like to compare it to a pendulum. So first, just to get us all on the same page, what is a pendulum? Or what might be an example of a pendulum that people could relate to? Excellent, Christian. Yes. If any of you are familiar with like the old big, grandfather clocks, they have a pendulum that swings back and forth. And that's ultimately how the clock, stays on a consistent time. So in general, just a pendulum is anything that is weighted at the end and swings back and forth. And so if we kind of look at the long history of the United States, there is this pattern of American political views swinging back and forth. Yes, exactly, Ryan, on a repeated rhythm. In terms of, what do a majority of Americans care about? What values are most important to them? What do they want out of government? And so at the start of the 1900s, we had the American pendulum swing more to the left. During the progressive era, Americans wanting a more active government, doing things like regulating the environment, regulating, the food and drug companies, as we talked about, regulating working conditions to protect working rights. And then again, with World War I, you really had an expansion of government involvement in things. But after World War I, and the Spanish flu, which also had a bunch of regulations in place, you had a growing number of Americans who started to say, well, now I feel like government's too involved in things. Government's doing too much. I want government to take a step back. I want government to become less involved in things. And so as we go into the 1920s, there are going to be more Americans that want smaller government, less economic regulation, and also just this growing desire to kind of cut loose. In many ways, the 1910s was a decade of responsibility for the country. Fighting World War I, everyone making these, sacrifices during Spanish flu. And so as the country goes into the 1920s, you have a lot of Americans who kind of want to cut loose, who don't want all these rules and restrictions. You also just have this growing consumerism of the 1920s, which when we talk about consumerism, that is the desire for people to want to go out and buy stuff, consuming products. And as we go into the 1920s, you have the rise of just new gadgets and technology people want in their homes, new fads in fashion and entertainment that people want to go out and enjoy. And so we are going to see a lot of economic activity in the 1920s. It's one of the reasons why the 1920s is called the Roaring 20s. But it is important to note that not all Americans are going to get to enjoy the benefits equally of the Roaring 20s. Based on what we've previously talked about in this class, who might get left out of fully getting to enjoy the Roaring 20s? Are there different groups of Americans that you would suspect maybe didn't get to participate in all of the fun and the excitement of the 1920s? Definitely. Black Americans will continue to be heavily discriminated against during this time period. You still have Jim Crow laws and segregation and poll taxes and literacy tests going on during this time period. So generally speaking, African Americans will be excluded from enjoying the benefits of the 1920s, but there will be some exceptions that we'll talk about next week. And then, yes, in general, the lower class, poor people, people who are, struggling just to make ends meet, they don't have the spare money to go out and buy all these new gadgets and fads of the 1920s. So, the lowest income of Americans, they're not really going to, find much to roar about in the 1920s. And Ryan, yes, to your comment. While things are improving for women, which we'll also talk about next week, there still is a lot of gender discrimination in the United States, and that's going to limit the full participation of women in the benefits of the 1920s. And then, excellent, Kylie, yes. For anyone familiar with the book, The Great Gatsby, this would be the time period that book takes place in. And ultimately, as a commentary on some of these themes of who did and who did not get to enjoy the lavish lifestyle of the 1920s. So as we start getting into the 1920s here, or again, the Roaring 20s as they're known, let's start off here with a chart. Looking, and yeah, Megan, that's it. It's for the rest of the class, kind of a comment of like, imagine throwing this, incredibly, luxurious over the top party while you have so many people out on the streets suffering. Like, how does someone do that? How do they justify that? That it kind of feels dystopian. Um, yeah, fair point. And I think that's something we see debated in the United States today. Of when you, for example, look at Jeff Bezos's like wedding in Italy, and how much money was spent on that, and thinking about how much good that money could have done if it was spent on something else. Yes, I ultimately I think there are a lot of comparisons we can make between the America of the late 1910s, 1920s, and where we currently are at as a country in the 2020s. I don't like to say that history repeats itself, because there are always differences, but there are definitely some rhyming themes. So looking at the chart here on the whiteboard, this is looking at the country's GNP, gross national product. It's basically an economic measurement of how much stuff is the economy producing. And so looking at the chart, what seems to happen to the GNP over the course of the 1920s? Yeah, clearly it's going up. There's really no year that it goes down. It either goes up or it kind of stays stable. But from 1921 to 1929, GNP grows by almost a third over the course of a single decade. That's a lot of economic growth within a single decade. So based on this chart, we could argue that economically, the 1920s were a very good decade for the United States. We see a lot of economic growth, in part because of this consumerism that spread throughout the United States. Americans wanting to go out and buy all kinds of stuff. And so the 1920s are oftentimes depicted as being an age of prosperity, where America's economy was on the rise with new technology and further industrialization. And hey, Hunter, thanks for letting me know. And yes, definitely make sure to check out the recording later when you can. Now, I've expanded the chart to now include the year 1930. What do you notice happening from 1929 to 1930? Yeah, it declines, Kylie, and dramatically. Because what we're seeing here is the start of the Great Depression, which is what we'll talk about when we come back second semester. And Michaela, thanks. Yeah, same thing. Just make sure to check out the recording later to catch what you missed. So I do think that's one thing that's important to keep in mind while studying the 1920s, is while this is a decade that many celebrated as they were going through it, it doesn't have a happy ending. It ultimately ends with the biggest economic crisis in American history. Because in many ways, this economic growth is a house of cards. It's growing, but it's not sturdy. It doesn't have a good foundation. And by the end of the 1920s, that house of cards is going to collapse. But of course, Americans did not know that at the time. The attitude was, let's let the good times roll. Let's just keep going. Because there were a lot of things that seemed like they were going well in the United States at the time. While electrical power, had previously been developed in the second half of the 1800s, it took a lot of time for electrical grids to be built throughout the United States. But by the 1920s, more and more Americans are now connected to electrical power, although many rural Americans still were not, because the attitude of electrical companies was, well, we're not going to spend the money to build electrical grids out to rural parts of the country. Like, there's not enough money to be made there. But one thing we can celebrate is by the 1920s, indoor plumbing is no longer just a luxury of the rich, and more Americans are also enjoying the benefits of indoor plumbing. Having running water inside their home, not having to go out to an outhouse to go to the bathroom, things like that. So obviously that's a huge win for everyone. The 1920s also sees the popularization of technologies, many of which had previously been invented. But again, whenever new technology gets invented, it usually starts off being very expensive and therefore only available to the rich. But by the 1920s, technology like the radio, home appliances like vacuum cleaners and refrigerators, and the telephone are becoming more affordable, allowing more Americans to own them. So by the 1920s, it's not just the rich, it's the middle class that has this stuff, and maybe even some members of the lower class who have kind of saved up having these things. Radio especially was incredibly important to Americans in the 1920s. That was their source of entertainment, because you don't have TV yet. You obviously don't have the internet or smartphones or anything like that. So people got a lot of their entertainment and information through the radio, not just listening to music, but that's how they got their news, is by listening to news programs on the radio. Radio stations would also have essentially radio play. So it'd kind of be like a TV show where there'd be a new episode, every week, but it would just be audio. It'd be voices and sound effects. But people would tune in and listen to that radio show every week, and then, the next day they would, talk about it with their friends. Good, Christian. Yeah, it's kind of similar to a podcast. Yeah. And so increasingly, Americans, had this itch of like, well, we need a radio in our home. We don't want to miss out on, this piece of technology that everyone else is using. Comparing that to today, do we have any examples like that today where you kind of feel like there's this culture of consumerism where people feel like they have to go out and get it, that they don't want to be left out? Yeah, and are there any products that kind of come to mind that are kind of similar to that? I would agree. TVs, there's very much that culture of, wanting to have the biggest TV possible, with the most pixels and, is it 4K or not? And then phones, absolutely. That might arguably be the best example we have today. You definitely have those people who, go out and get the latest version of the iPhone as soon as it comes out. Even if, the phone they currently have works perfectly fine, but, like, no, I want the newest, bestest version of it. Video game consoles, definitely. I think you see that there. Or, gaming PCs as well. And definitely, right. Social media, I think, plays a big part of that. Building this environment of, what's trending, what's in style, what do you need to care about in order to be, with it. Clothing, for sure. I think that's one we see throughout history of, oh, you don't want to be wearing outdated clothing. You need to go out and get the latest fashions. That's going to be true in the 1920s. You definitely see elements of that still to this day. Yeah. So, to wrap up for today, let's do a quick exit ticket and send you on your way. So, using the polling tools on the whiteboard, which of the following is not a characteristic of America after World War I? Would it be A, growing fear of foreign political views and crackdown on immigration? B, increased consumerism as Americans increasingly demanded the latest gadgets and fads? C, a return to isolationism and preference to keep the country out of world affairs? Or D, a shared push for racial equality after experiencing the divisions during the war? Which of those was not a characteristic of America after World War I? Again, using the polling tools there on the whiteboard. And thank you for those who've responded already. If you're still not sure, go ahead and take an educated guess. As always, I'm never going to penalize or yell at someone for getting the wrong answer. But it's helpful, lets me see kind of what we're thinking, how we're doing as a group. Let me see here if I can get a couple more responses in here. So still looking for a response from Amira, Abby, Anaya, Andrew, Arshan, Vanessa, Carly, Haley, Corbin, Dayton, Ian, Ellie, Faith, Gracie, Guadalupe, Hunter, Jean, Joseph, Laura, Liza, London, Marche, Mason, Morgan, Naya, Rory, Ryan, Sophia, and Will. All right, good, good. And as more answers are coming in, majority of us going with D, and you would be correct. While there were, many African Americans that hoped this would be the case, I think an argument can be made that the racial situation in the United States got worse going into the 1920s. Again, because of the Great Migration and more African Americans moving into northern cities and states, we see a spread of racial violence into the north. As we will talk about next week, you're actually going to have a dramatic rise in membership to the Ku Klux Klan during the 1920s. So unfortunately, really the opposite happens in America in the aftermath of World War I. That race relationships get worse in the United States in the aftermath of World War I. But definitely everything else we see. With a growing fear of foreign political views, we have the Red Scare and the Palmer raids, and new immigration laws that restrict immigrants coming into the United States. We just talked about the increased consumerism, Americans wanting to buy radios, phones, appliances. Next week, we'll talk about the rise of the automobile and Americans starting to buy cars. And then definitely we also see C, a rejection of the Treaty of Versailles, America never joining the League of Nations. Kind of this attitude of like, all right, we did enough during World War I. We need some me time. We don't care what the rest of the world is doing. America's just going to kind of focus on doing its own thing. So don't forget about doing your weekly reflection this week. If you have any questions about anything, stick around, let me know. Otherwise, you're good to go. Hope you enjoy the upcoming weekend, and I will see you back here on Monday.